Thanks for coming to my talk. My name is Mani. I'm a software developer, a .NET software developer, and I've been consulting in the UK for the last 10 years. And this is where I work at the moment, which is an educational digital agency. And we develop and maintain a few Umbraco websites, going back from version 6 up to version 7.2.8. So in the last 2 months, we launched this new website for British Red Cross. It's called First Aid Learning for young people. And this website, we had to host it in Azure and using Umbraco 7. So I'm going to talk about just a couple of the problems which I came across in order to achieve this. And specifically, the two problems are: how do I set up continuous deployment of an Umbraco site to Azure? Now, for the previous versions of Azure, we've used Jenkins, and most of our other websites use Jenkins for continuous integration and continuous deployment. But for this site, we wanted to use Azure. And also, our front-end engineering processes and practices, I didn't really want to change it. They were using grunt, and there's so many compilation stuff that goes on in front-end these days. So I wanted to maintain the same process. So those are the two objectives. And our Azure, I decided that we'll have the Umbraco 7 hosted, website hosted in Azure Websites. It's now called Azure Web Apps, I think. So it's not a virtual machine or anything like that. It's an Azure website. So first thing is we created a resource group for this project alone. It's just a logical grouping of resources in Azure. And then with Azure Websites, you can create app plans. So we created a dev plan, and it's a small instance, a dev plan, which basically has the UAT website, and a deployment slot of the UAT website is the dev website. So the aim is to continuously deploy to the dev slot. Now, slots in Azure websites are meant to be switchable, so you can deploy to one slot and then make it live and things like that. No, I didn't use that feature, although I had intentions of using it. Then I really couldn't understand certain bits and pieces, and given the fact that we had a SQL Server and all that, so we didn't go down that route. So that's so as you can see here, this is the dev plan setup. The production looks like that at the moment. So we have two separate SQL Server instances and one database within each one of them, one for the staging slot and the other for the production web app. Now, I just thought it would be it would make use of less resources if we had only one SQL Server in the development environment. Also, if you notice, the media files in Umbraco are normally stored in the file system, the server file system. That's how we started off initially. Life was very good, but then we had to move all the media files to Azure Blob Storage. And that's a whole talk on its own. There's so much of complications that comes with that. But luckily, the website is running in this setup at the moment. And it's also a nightmare how to sync between all these different environments. So when we are developing a project, there could be some people testing it. They could be adding some media resources which the developers may want to test on their development environment, and so on and so forth. So it does add a lot of complications. So that's the environment. So the aim which I have is to continuously deploy from a Git repository to the dev slot. At the moment, deploying to any other slots and sites is manual in the sense each one of those web apps or slots has its own Git repository. So once we push into that Git repository, then the continuous deployment does happen, but it's not as continuous as it happens with the dev slot, because in the dev slot you have the front-end team pushing their code into the repository, whereas if I want to get anything on the UAT or the production, then I manually trigger the continuous build. So that's the difference. So what, in fact, I have not told you the main problem. The main problem is the Git repository we use in EdComs is part of something called Assembler, which is a project management, ticket management SaaS solution. They also have a Git repository. So that's what we use. So although it's easy to just push to the Git repository of that particular web slot, the first problem I had was we are pushing code into the Git repository of Assembler. So how do I then trigger a push to the Git repository associated with the web slot for the website? So that's the first problem. So the way it works is like this. So when a developer, front-end or back-end developer pushes their code change to Assembler Git repo, the Assembler Git repo should somehow talk to this REST API, which is part of Kudu. Now, Kudu is the deployment engine which is behind the Azure websites. So every Azure website has a Git repo, and it also comes with this Kudu deployment engine. So, and it exposes most of its functionality as a REST API. So if we do a Git post, a HTTP post to the Kudu REST API, then that in turn does a pull from the repository which we choose. So once at this point, the Kudu will go and pull the source, and it will look for a file called deployment. It's actually a .deployment file, which in turn has the command which it needs to run. So for most ASP.NET websites, it is a batch file, deploy.command. And then whatever is in the deploy.command, that gets executed. Normally, that creates a deployment. So every time this deploy.command is run, a deployment is created, and it is kept in the file system in Kudu and in the Azure website. And then if the deployment is successful, then it takes the last successful deployment and syncs the files with the www root, and that's how the code lands up in the website. So I'm basically going to show you the two main tasks, which is the HTTP post and how the git pull happens from Kudu. And at a later point in time, I will show you how I've modified the deploy.command to do some front-end compilation, things like grunt, compass, and things like that. Now, the problem we had with compass is, basically compiles your SAS files. And the compass framework requires Ruby. And Ruby isn't out of the box in Azure websites. So that's the biggest challenge. When we run, if we have an instruction in deploy.command which requires Ruby, then it doesn't work. So those are the two big problems I'm going to show you. So that's the slides, and I'm going to show you some photos, or pictures rather. So give me a second. So this is the documentation for Kudu, and it's all open source, it's on GitHub. This is the REST API documentation, and in particular, this is for the deployment section of the Kudu REST API. Of interest to us is this post. So if we do a HTTP post with that payload, that will trigger Kudu to go and fetch the source code from that Git repository. In my case, it is an assembler Git repository. Now, in order for Kudu to go and pull source from my assembler Git repository, it needs authentication, right? So what we then do is create an SSH. There is a REST API. I'll come to this. So this REST API in Kudu allows you to create a SSH key, and it will give you back the public SSH key, which you can take and put it in your Git repository to authenticate. So which is what I've done. If I can get to the next slide, that is. Right. So this, what you can see here is I'm using PowerShell to basically invoke that REST API, and this will return the SSH key which you see there, and we then have to take this and put it in assembler's authentication section. So once this is done, we can make the we can trigger from assembler. There is a facility to trigger a post request whenever a code is pushed into the Git repository. So I'm making use of that to achieve it. Now, so that way, Kudu and my assembler Git repository can talk to each other. So that problem is solved, right? Now, how do we modify this deploy.command? Or where do we even get it from? So for every Azure website, there is this magic backend website called, so if you have first aid for young proj dev is the website name. If you put a .scm followed by the rest of the URL, you'll get into this user interface, which is a console side of your website. From here, this is the Kudu environment, so this is a graphical user interface. Now the REST APIs you saw earlier, the deploy and the SSH REST API, we can't access it from the user interface. That's why I had to invoke it using PowerShell. And you can see that for this website, there is a folder called repository, and it has two files, the .deployment and the deploy.command. this gets created automatically. There is a command line tool you can use to create these two files. So let's see if I have that here. So this is the Azure command line tool. So if you run Azure site deployment script, it will give you the options. It will show you the help file, help options as to what you can do. As you can see, you can create a deployment file for PHP, Node, Python, even a .NET console application, and so on. In my case, I wanted a ASP web application project. As you can see on the right hand side. So what that does is it creates those two standard, if I can get to it. So it creates those two files. And now I need to go in and modify the deploy.command to do all the grunt and install Ruby and all that stuff, which is what I'm going to show you now. Before we do that, this is just to show you that the .deployment file is basically telling you where the actual deployment file is, which one is the deployment file, and then this is the standard ASP.NET web application project deployment file. What you can see here is it does some NuGet package restore, and it then does a build of the CS proj, and finally there is a Kudu sync. Kudu sync is the file sync thing they have developed to sync files between the file system. So these are the three basic steps. This is the out of the box command file. Now I'm going to modify this to include all my bits in it. So the first thing I need is I need Ruby, and Ruby is not included out of the box, whereas Node and NPM is available. So you can simply say NPM and you can install packages, but there is no Ruby. So this trick I learned from one of the blog posts by Scott Hanselman, where he sets up a Ruby-based website, a static HTML website. So this is completely coming from there, but I've modified it to suit my needs. So the first thing we do is check if there is a Ruby folder, and if there is Ruby, then basically skip the whole thing. If not, do a curl and get the Ruby and get it installed. There are some nuances with this, but for me, luckily, it worked the very first time I did it, so it's not that tricky. Once Ruby is done, then we do some gem installs. So here we are installing Compass, SUSE, and Breakpoint, which is all needed for the front-end compilation and all that stuff. So that's the initial installation required. Now this runs every time. Of course, if Ruby is already there, then it doesn't fetch it. And then when the NuGet packages are being restored, after the NuGet packages are restored, then we are again restoring some package.json packages, which is which contains this requirement for grunt CLI. And normally, if you are in a development environment, you would run grunt CLI -g. That means it's available across all your sessions. But in this case, you can't do that because it's not available. It's available only on that session. And it gives you a warning of that, but it doesn't matter really. So once the grunt CLI is installed, then we can actually run the grunt command, which will go and run the front-end compilation and all that stuff. And once the front-end bits are all built, before syncing the the actual source code. We also do some syncing of the CSS and JavaScript files. So those are all the modifications I had to do to get this done. I'm going to show you a deployment tail. Right. So once a push happens to the assembler Git repository, Kudu will automatically fetch all the files and things like that, and then it will start running the deploy.command. At that point, what we can do is, again using the Azure command line interface, we can run this command. On line number 4, you see the Azure site log tail. Basically, you want to see the log of what's happening during this deployment process. So this is essentially the log. So as you can see, it's actually downloading Ruby, and it's unzipping the ruby.zip file in line number 13. Then once that is done, then it installs some gems. Here on line number 35 is installing the compass, which takes quite a while, by the way. And then it installs the SUSE gem, the breakpoint, and then comes .NET Web Application Deployment, which is the standard out-of-the-box thing. But we are then restoring the JSON package.json packages, which then installs the grunt CLI. Now once the grunt CLI is installed, then we run the grunt command, which in turn does so many things like cleaning up the CSS, minifying the JavaScript, creating a revision of the JavaScript, and all that stuff, which, to be honest, I've not looked at it in depth. That's the front-end engineering team. Once all that is done, then it does the normal MS build. So after the MS build, then it's all syncing up the files to the server. That's all that is, and that's what is happening. So finally, it gets to the destination. So that's Kudu basically. You have any questions? Yeah. This one, I was not particular about reducing the deployment time, but this one I think, let me check. Okay, I've run this on. This is in the dev plan. Okay, so this particular deployment, which I'm showing you here, is an extra slot I created in a small instance dev plan. So naturally, resources are much low. So you can see it started around 9:04. No, that's not right. 17:09, and then it finishes. Okay. Around 17:21. This doesn't happen all the time. This happens for the very first time when you're getting the Ruby package and all that stuff. But generally, it's faster, and I'm pretty sure if I spend time, I can make it much more faster by doing some clever tricks and things. You can also integrate any other anything you can run on command line can be put into this deploy.command. So there are blog posts where they talk about testing being part of this deployment process. So yeah, I mean we have npm, and then we have Ruby. Then pretty much we can achieve whatever we want with that, I think. Yeah.
What kind of errors have you noticed?
What kind of errors? Oh, you mean what's not worked? It took a while for me to invoke the REST API using PowerShell because I've never done that before, and PowerShell is scary. I tried to use Postman, the Google Chrome plugin, but PowerShell worked because in the Kudu blog or the wiki, they have given a sample PowerShell script which actually works. So I've used that. So that took a while. In this deployment .command file, it took a while to understand the folder structure so there is a repository folder, then there is a tools folder which contains some development tools and things like that. So not getting moving to the correct directory to execute the correct command was a problem, but those you will anyway face when you start working on it. So nothing drastic has failed as such. Okay. All right, so that's it really. Thank you very much for listening.